Thank you. Oh, my word. It really is fantastic to be here with y'all. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I've been coming to Lincoln up to Waverly for a number of years now, as Father mentioned, doing priest intensives. And it really is one of my greatest joys to just walk with priests in helping them wrestle with this idea of human sexuality, this topic that there's been such a veil of secrecy, such a veil of silence, such a veil of shame that has surrounded for so long and for so many. And in some small way, my hope in my professional work is to contribute to the tearing of that veil, to allow us to talk more openly, to talk more honestly, to engage in a deeper level of understanding of the beauty of God's design for human physiology, for neuropsychology, and ultimately Christian theology. So I'm a really big fan of doing new things and making myself potentially look like an idiot, as you're going to find out. So my hair, that's not part of that. The bow tie, like that's just me. But did you ever hear the one about the Nazarene psychologist that walked into a room full of Catholics and tried to teach them about love and responsibility? Me neither, because it's happening right now. So I approached this conversation with a lot of humility, with the recognition and the ownership that I'm not coming authoritatively in any way. I'm coming as someone who has been privileged out of relationship and friendship with Father Sean and with many priests from around the country to offer some insights and reflections from a neuroscientific perspective, from a psychological perspective, from a sexological perspective, with the idea, and through the best lens that I have for integrating Catholic thinking. And I'm sure what I have to offer will fall far short of the capacities that you have to think Catholically. And I want to own that and put that out on the front end. When you go like, wait a minute, there's a lot more to this. Yes, there's a lot more to this. And this will kind of be a brief survey or an overview of this model that I've been working on for, I don't know, it's been a number of years now. But trying to attach, and what I found in reading Love and Responsibility is how much just organic thinking of mine resonates with the text. Right, that there is this really beautiful, in the context of 1960s culture and a Catholic framework in that so much truth still resonates. And in fact, as we have the benefit of neuroscience and the amazing ability to take pictures of what, like, I don't know, David was writing about in the Psalms or what the writer of the Proverbs was saying, like, it's pretty amazing. 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, we have pictures of and like all these amazing biblical principles and points of church teaching. But I just want to humbly step into this space and offer some reflections to get you thinking, right? Like that the goal of this is not to leave you somehow with a nugget of knowledge that is final, but rather the opening of ongoing conversations that I hope emerge from this time and space together. And my hope would be that you find some degree of resonance from what you've talked about in this series so far that maybe somehow comes together in a unique way and in a different way for you. So it really is a pleasure to be with you. And I get to talk about one of my favorite things and talk about some of my favorite stories that our Lord has graciously gifted me with, that kind of when they're happening, you're like, this is going to be a great story, but I'm not sure where it's going to fit in my life. I never thought I was going to be like the Nazarene sex guy that befriended an amazing priest and got to travel around the country talking about sex all the time. Not the trajectory I had set out for my life. And yet here I am, trying to obediently and faithfully step through these doors that our Lord has so faithfully opened in my life. And be careful what you pray for, because I'm sure when Father Sean started out being obedient to Jesus, moving into this realm of, like, I don't know, talking about pornography and asking questions like, what kind of books are our kids reading? And like, how do we prepare our teenagers for like living out healthy sexuality as they grow and marry? I bet he never thought that Jesus was going to answer his prayer with like, here comes the Nazarene sex guy to the rescue. Not even to the rescue, like mentor, that was a bit overdone. If anything, I've been challenged and stimulated in my thinking and in my reflections, probably far more than I've ever acknowledged to you. And I just have so much gratitude, Father Sean, for who you are and for the friendship that we share. As you can tell, I'm going to talk long because I always do that. He's still in the intro. Yeah. The title that I want to use tonight for us is Love and Responsibility, Reflections on Trinity Sexuality and the Incarnational Reality of Imago Dei. And again, a text that was so fascinating for me to look at the context, to look at how much truth resonates across time and context, and a work, a resource that I invite you to maybe re-experience. If you've never read Love and Responsibility, I invite you to experience it. If you've read it before, I really encourage you and challenge you after this series concludes. I really invite you to double back to that and maybe see with the new eyes. Because that's where I'm going to be operating from, is someone that's coming, if I have the gift of anything, it's in this space, it's the gift of objectivity, of maybe coming to a resource that's so familiar to you, but with new eyes and a different frame of reference as a neuroscientist and a psychologist and a sexologist, to maybe pull some facets from it that because of either the familiarity get lost, or perhaps an unfamiliarity. It's not a text that you've engaged. It's not a book that you've opened. And either way, I invite you to double back into that space, because there are just these incredible insights and glimpses of truth that as a whole, I think reverberate with where we're at as a culture right now, negotiating this dynamic of human sexuality in a very different way, with a very different intensity, at a very different pace and a very different speed than I think we've ever seen before. So I think there's a lot of misperceptions that I hear. I have the chance to travel around the country and hear a lot from people, and we'll do some Q&A a little bit later, and I'll probably not give you satisfactory answers, because the questions that most of us are wrestling with are much bigger than the 38.5-second response that I'm going to have time to give to you. So really, this is a conversation that I hope initiates a lot more wrestling, a lot more exploring, rather than me giving some final answer to anything. But we have this kind of cultural misconception. And in Love and Responsibility, there's this phrase that really captured my attention. It was a bit too graphic on my request to Father Sean. Like, would this title work? I think it was called like The Myth of Orgasm. He was like, that might be a bit steep. I'm like, dude, I trust you. Let's fix it. But I think that's the language I would borrow from the text, with this kind of cultural mythology that we carry, that really this point of pleasure, this pleasurable dimension of human sexuality, is the primary function, or the primary driver, the primary pursuit that we're oriented to. And right, we'll look at how this manifests itself as I go through this presentation. But I think it is a misconception that there's this reductionism of the human person, right, to this utilitarian, right? Like, what does me the most good? It's not just Jeremy Bentham's like, what does the most good for the most people, right? It's almost this egotistical utilitarianism, right? Almost a hedonism of sorts, right? Like, what provides me the most pleasure and helps me avoid the most pain is the greatest good. And we see that played out in a variety of ways, in a variety of contexts, every day in our culture. So I don't think it's a huge claim for me to show up and say, like, gee, we have this kind of pleasurable dynamic that people orient to sexually. That guy's really smart. A common misconception nonetheless, right? Like, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But I think we have to attune ourselves to the reality that it's this mindset that's so pervasive, almost insidious in its quietude, that it subtly draws us to a place where we realize, ooh, maybe that's my orientation to my relationship, to my marriage, to my body. And how does maybe a more transcendent understanding of the human person shape our ways of thinking, our ways of being, our ways of doing? So I bring this up not to add some fantastic new insight to what you already know, but perhaps it's this, again, insidious familiarity, this fact that we don't recognize the ways in which advertising, music, media, movies, right, subtly condition us to lower and lower thresholds for stimulation, right? That even as followers of Jesus, as we try and navigate a hypersexualized culture, right, we're enticed into this redefining of truth through the lens of pleasure. Right, but I think we have another common misperception that shows up in the church, right? And it's almost inverted of this paradigm around the notion of pleasure. You see, for years, when I would hear priests talk about this text, love and responsibility, it would operate on this dyad, right? This notion of the unitive and the procreative, right? Almost at the exclusion of the idea of pleasure, right? Like, which as a sexologist, I was like, well, wait a minute. And as a neuroscientist, I thought, well, wait a minute. Like, there's more to this story. But I think this veil of secrecy and this veil of shame and this veil of silence that I hear from good, faithful, Christian, evangelical, Catholic, right, around the country, there's this unwillingness to delve down into some of the practicals that God ordained as good in our human physiology, in our human sexuality, in our reproductive systems, in our neurophysiology, and how they all match up and tell a story. And this aversion, right, again, because of shame, because of secrecy, because of discomfort, right, becomes this kind of inverted paradigm where we almost run the risk philosophically of the same reductionism. We just reduce the person to the unitive and the procreative and dissect this element, this God-given design that's declared good, that has to be integrated into a more holistic understanding for our sexuality. If we're going to reclaim it, we have to reclaim the totality of God's design for sexuality and not just operate in this kind of inverted partiality, which is tempting for us to do, right? Like, we live in a really bifurcated culture in this time and space, right? Politically, it's pretty bifurcated. Economically, the disparity continues to grow between rich and poor. Like, it's easy for us unknowingly, subconsciously, to be pulled into this kind of inverted living of, well, if that's what culture says, I'm going to do the opposite and therefore be holy. And if I'm here to challenge anything, it's this idea of perhaps it's not about living an inverted life by way of doing something different than culture. I think we're called to that as followers of Jesus. But I think there's something about reclaiming the wholeness of God's design. And I fundamentally believe that this series has really been a progression in walking into reclaiming the wholeness, the fullness, the totality of God's design for this beautiful thing called sexuality that's become so distorted in our culture. And that's what I want to do tonight is, how much time do I have left? Like 13 minutes? I want to engage as much as we can that question, just to raise your curiosity, not to answer all the questions. There's going to be more questions raised than there are answered, because that's what happens when you bring an academic to talk. Right? But I want there to be questions. I want there to be this curiosity, because that's part of how we collectively begin to think differently and wrestle differently and ask questions differently and reflect differently and talk differently and tear this veil of sometimes shame, sometimes secrecy, sometimes silence that pervades the church. So what I want to do is walk you through this model that I've had the chance to work on for 10 or 11 years now. And it's really basic, right? Like, I think of how do I, right, like, keep things simple for myself. I use a lot of triangles because they're kind of Trinitarian. And I try and use like words that start with the same letter. So the O model, there's nothing like secretive about it. It's just pretty straightforward. So the O model is my best attempt at taking these parts of the cultural conversation and the church conversation in their partiality and integrating them into a whole model, and then kind of orienting them through the lens of God's design for human physiology, God's design for relationship, God's design for not just relationship on a physical level, but like a transcendent spiritual relationship with Him. Right? And this is what I've come up with that I want to take some time to walk you through, and then talk about the sexual cycle. So you hear a lot of, from me tonight, Masters and Johnson, kind of these early sexologists, kind of their cycle for understanding how human physiology works. What is this design at a biological level? And then you'll hear me kind of refine that through a more theological lens or through a more neuroscientific lens. But these parts of the O model of human sexuality, oxytocin, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, it's a neuropeptide, can be a neurotransmitter, super critical in the human relationship experience, not just sexually. Offspring, obviously, that there is this procreative dimension alongside the unitive dimension. And we're going to wrestle with this myth of orgasm and kind of maybe recalibrate the importance of orgasm in the functioning of both the unitive and the procreative. And I think, and I hope, and I trust that there'll at least be enough detail in that to get you curious about recalibrating our understanding that the unitive and procreative are certainly significant in God's design for human sexuality. And this thing that we don't talk about a lot, this thing that is probably the most distorted part of sexuality in American culture and most Western cultures with regard to pleasure, it's redeemable. And there's a functionality to it that's different than the distorted manifestations that we see in the culture that we inhabit here in the United States. So let's look at some of these distortions. I think that the first distortion I'd like to talk with you about is this procreative dimension. When offspring become the primary focus, the primary goal of human sexuality. Right? As a psychologist, I see this a lot in couples, and even in my own marriage, have experienced kind of when there's distress around fertility, when there's like difficulty getting pregnant, when other times it's just reduction to the biological act. There's not a lot of emotional connection, so sometimes there's post-traumatic spaces where intercourse can become relatively focused on just the mechanics, just the procreative end, at the exclusion of that bonding, that closeness, and even at the expense of pleasure. Did I give you guys a graphic warning? Like, this is a PG-13. I'm terrible about like not telling people, like, did he just say orgasm 17 times? Just wait. Right, that this procreative dimension is really critical. It's part of God's design. But if we look at it just scientifically, and we live in such a scientifically conversant society, to the point of like most people throw around neuroscientific terms like they picked up in the New Yorker or somewhere, like they're a neuroscientist. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. Like, do you even know what that is and what it does? No, but I read about it. I think it speaks to this propensity for us to move to a place of biological reductionism culturally. And I think that's where a lot of the cultural conversation is centered for a long time, right? I mean, think about Lady Gaga pranced around and saying, born this way, right? Like, and it resonated because we live in this reductionistic culture, and then the arts are borrowing from the sciences, right? Like these appeals to logic that are really unfounded because like not everything is rooted exclusively in our biology. Right? At least from our perspective, I would assume theologically, like that we believe that we're more than just this biological experience. But we live in a culture where one of the primary rules is appeal to reductionism. Right? Genetics are the lowest common denominator, and therefore the highest value in an argument. Right? So we hear all these claims that sexuality is just biological; it's in your genes. Right? Pleasure is secondary gain; it doesn't even matter. Right? That there's something else. It could be power that's obtained. It's not about the pleasure, right? It could be that it's power over someone. So when we think about rape culture at college campuses around the country, right? Like it's not about the pleasure necessarily of the moment. There's something else that's more biological, right? Like my biological exertion of authority and power over someone, right? It's really mechanical. I hear this a lot in stories where there's infertility, right? Like, Todd, we've had sex every 36 hours for the whole window of fertility. And I think I don't want to see her again until next month when she has an open window of fertility. I'm like, I know, right? Like I've been there, and it loses its luster. It loses the sense of connectivity. It loses the sense of sacredness when the focus becomes not like we're charged with bearing a soul and birthing it into existence because it's an expression, an overflow of God's love in our lives. Like it's just, we have to do this to make a baby, right? And we kind of accidentally or incidentally fall into, right, a very common misconception culturally. right? But I think what's important for us to recognize in this is that there's an unresolved part of the sexual cycle, right? It doesn't operate in the fullness of its design. And I'm going to show you that here in a second. So, right, like we know that having offspring, reproducing is critical to Christian theology, right? Like it's instructed biblically, right? Like that's nothing new. And culturally, what we see is this disconnect from the reproductive process, the procreative end, from the act, right? Like we see it with contraception, right? We see it with sexual practices, right, that are normalized. Right? Ways of avoiding the potential for fertilization, right? And how normalized those become. There's some fascinating research on this, like how purity culture, right, like shifted the way young people in the church were developing sexually. Right? Like there's this aversion to vaginal intercourse because of the purity movement that then led to lots of other expressions of sexual contact. Right? I'm trying to keep this PG-13 and not R, but it may not go well. Right? That even the sexual norms and mores culturally and in the church were shaped by this idea of like, I have contraception, so it's no big deal. Or I can't get her pregnant, therefore we need to modify our ways of expressing ourselves sexually to avoid that end. Right? Like both are distortions. Different starting points, but the similar distortion of God's design for human sexuality. Right? It's operating in its impartiality. Right? And that's what we're called to, is this fullness of God's design. Story time. It's always funny to see what Jesus does with our stories. As far as like, that was a random experience. How's that going to get used? So I was in Las Vegas. Now I'm Nazarene, right? Like if you want to translate that in the Greek, it's like boring prude that doesn't drink or have fun anywhere. Fifth generation. Thank you very much. All right. So my wife and I go to Las Vegas. I'm just done with graduate school. I ran a campus ministry at Oklahoma State while I was doing graduate school. So worked a lot, studied a lot. Didn't have much time for vacation or much money for vacation. So I got done with grad school, got with my internship at the University of Kansas, and looked at my wife and said, I need a vacation. I had 2 weeks off between undergraduate and graduate school. So like I went to school for 9 straight years. I wouldn't advise that as a path of pursuing higher ed. So after 9 years of study, I finally got a vacation. We had like $117 to our name, because that's what grad school does to you. Those of y'all that are in school, beware. Those of you who have done that, right? Like I feel your pain. Grad school does its dirty work, but it leaves you better prepared for life. $117, like seriously, like we had no money. And I looked at my wife, I was like, I need a vacation. She said, let me see what I can do. She's a masterful researcher. And she came back a couple days later. She said, okay, I got us 4 days and 3 nights at the Flamingo in Las Vegas for like $37 total. It wasn't quite that low, but like it was ridiculous. And then on like August 21st, when we stepped off the plane in Las Vegas, it was 124 degrees. I thought like, well, no crap. It cost $37. Nobody wants to be here right now. Right. So when you're like, you know, a boring person, you go to Las Vegas, you don't gamble, you don't like go to shows because we were poor. We just walked around and looked at stuff. All right. Good times. Because after grad school, that's all I wanted to do. Was like, I don't want to do anything. I just want to like be, like walk around and watch people, right? Because I was a new psychologist and I love watching people because people are fascinating. And it didn't disappoint. So it's this hot day. I mean, it's like literally cooking things on the sidewalk. And I probably had like a secondary high because everybody smokes marijuana, even in 2008 in Las Vegas. It was a very interesting experience for this very naive Nazarene bow tie wearing guy to experience. So we ducked into the MGM Grand. And who's been in the MGM Grand? Lots of sinners in the room. Thank you for confessing. Right? Like you remember if you've been there that there's this amazing lion exhibit where you can like get up close and personal to the lions. Right? So my wife and I, we felt out of place. Like everyone had 2 very large adult beverage containers and they were slurping them down because it was like 4 o'clock and crazy hot. And we're just like, where are we at? I'll never forget what happened. There's this throng of people, and as a freshly minted psychologist, I think like, well, I need to like see what's going on because there's lots of people, and there's lots of people expecting something's going to happen. Graduate school was way overpriced, right? Like anybody could have seen that. But we watched and we waited, and this lion, this male lion, right, like wakes up from his slumber, and he must have heard the keeper's keys jingling or some stimulus woke him up from his rest. And I'll never forget this. He wakes up and stretches, right? Now think about where I'm at. I'm in Las Vegas. It's 4:00. People are drinking, right? There's a huge throng of people. And as soon as the lion gets up and stretches, right, like this awe makes its way through the crowd. Ooh, oh. I was like, okay, it's a lion. Like, that's cool, but like, maybe I should start drinking. And this lion, right, he looks over and he sees his food bowl. So I'm assuming it was the keeper preparing food. And he walks over to his food bowl and he looks down and kind of dejectedly looks in it. And it's empty, right? Like the poor lion. This part always makes me laugh. Like, I can't believe this happened. So then the lion takes about 3 steps further and there's this sleeping lioness, right? And in my mind, it plays in slow motion, which sounds kind of creepy when you hear what happens. But like this lion then like squats down and begins thrusting on this sleeping lioness in Las Vegas, Nevada, in front of a drunken throng of people. And the place exploded. Yeah! Wah! Right? Yeah, this is amazing. Best day ever. And I was like, I definitely need to start drinking. Like, I am missing out. Right? And then, right, like I wish that's where the funny story ended, right? Like maybe that's where the funny part of the story ends. And then the comments took a turn. You give it to her. She deserves it. Make it hurt. And I thought to myself, oh my, like this is not comfortable for me. This peek into our American sexual mindset that I didn't want to find as a naive, freshly minted psychologist, teetotaling Nazarene, right? Like something was revealed to me. And I think, as I think back about that space, like audibly I heard our Lord whisper, like this is their cultural sexual narrative. And as I look back, like from that point in time, like Jesus began opening doors for me to lean into this space and to step into this space. And that's where his call on my life started with regard to like, what are you going to do? Right? Are you going to faithfully step into these opportunities and experiences that I give you to address this pandemic that seems so innocent? It seems so fun. It's just a lion. Until the experience in front of these folks revealed a bit more about them and about their struggles and about their stories than just the fact that lions do what lions do. Right? Like there's a biological explanation. Like the lion was just in estrus, in heat. Right? And lions do what lions do because they're lions. But how easy it is in a culture where we reduce personhood to biology for us to just borrow the logic and say like, well, that's what I do because that's what humans do. And like God gave me this thing. I need to use it. I need to use it as much as I can. Right? And story after story, as a sex addiction therapist in my office, I can tell you like this plays in the cultural imagination, but it's incongruent. Not that it's wrong, right? Like that the procreative end is an essential part of God's design for human sexuality, but it's a part that's been distorted. It's a part that's been misunderstood by culture. And I think that's part of the story of reclaiming it, is reorienting an understanding of the procreative end. All right, with this model, Masters and Johnson's model really starts with a state of being unaroused on a biological level. It's about an unaroused sexual state that moves into excitement and arousal. Right? And we know all the key symptoms of this. Blood starts pooling to the front of the female. Blood starts pooling to the front of the male. There's this mirroring process in not just their genitalia, but total physiological activation. Right? Preparing them for like face-to-face, eye-to-eye, front-to-front types of contact. Right? Not even sexually, but hugging and holding and caressing that then moves into right? Sexual excitability. And then plateau, right? Like with penetration, this plateau process. And we'll get to plateau, and I'm going to try and redeem this idea of plateau in the sexual cycle a little bit later, because I think it serves a really critical function. It's like the throwaway construct. Like most people hate the plateau, right? Like, I just want to like get excited and then be there already, right? Because that's the primary function for most folks. And we're going to kind of talk about the dangers of the pleasure domain and kind of this orgasmic ideal in culture, the myth of orgasm, if you will. But after that, right, like there's this kind of general avoidance, this general aversion, right? Like I've done my thing biologically. I mean, literally this lion got up after 4 thrusts and a cigarette and like walked back to where it was laying at the beginning and waited on its food to get there. I'm glad I got a laugh on that one. Like I've got a really quick humor, so if you don't keep up. Right, there's this general avoidance, this aversion, right? It's kind of like hooking up on campus and then like going back and playing video games. Like we were at the bar and then I met someone and then we hooked up and then I went back and played video games, or like went to my friend's house and played pool, or like whatever, right? Like there's just this transactional dynamic to this, right? Like where it wasn't even really about the intensity of the orgasm. It was just about the function biologically. And then we go back to this sexually unaroused state, and it's a compartmentalization, right? That there's this disconnect from our bodies. So I'm going to teach you guys some new language. I grew up watching the old school Batman. Yes. You'll recognize he's like bam and pow, right? Like remember when he would like sucker punch the Joker and it'd be like bam, and then pow. Bam, I don't have anything for, right? Like bam is just orgasm in my language, right? Bam. Wasn't there like a chef that used to do that? Now you're not going to be able to unsee that, are you? Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Right? Like there's this bam, right? This intensity of experience. But then there's this POW, this post-orgasmic window that I'm going to talk to you about here in a little bit. And this post-orgasmic window serves a really critical function. And in this model, this lack of healthy resolution, right? Resolution would be this back end, like what happens after the bam. Right? Like this post-orgasmic window is really essential space. And in this kind of biologically informed model, there's not a whole lot of emphasis given to the post-orgasmic window. In fact, that's what's avoided. Right? And culture does a fantastic job of this, right? Like how many movies have you seen where there's like this intense moment of sexual intimacy between the primary protagonists, right? Like, and then later he straps on his gun and like goes and blows up the ship and everybody is saved. Right? Like we're conditioned for this. Right? Like it wasn't even about like the penultimate experience of pleasure. It was like, I need to do this because this is what I do. And then I'm going to go kill somebody because that's what I do too. Right? And there's this hypermasculinity that really quietly informs this space of avoidance. Right? Because we don't know how to be intimate. And I don't mean like intimate, sexual, biological. I mean like intimate in the fullness of how we're created in God's image. And that's the process to reclaim. And it shows up very practically in how we navigate the sexual cycle. But there's this kind of procreative variable that's super critical in God's design for human sexuality. And then how it gets distorted is the avoidance of it, or the distortion of it, or the use of contraceptives to, in fact, like truly bifurcate and cut that part out of the model. But that's not the only distortion, right? I would suggest that this secondary distortion, I would call on the pleasurable dimension. And it's where the idea of orgasm becomes the primary focal point. And I think with the advent of online pornography, this mindset tends to grow. I think with what we're seeing now with animatronic devices, sex robots, which is a fascinating, like I don't have time to talk about that tonight. If somebody asks a question about it later, I'll talk about it. Right, like all these ways that technology is being used to intensify the human experience beyond God's original design and intent. Now you can call them supernormal stimuli if you want to borrow a nerdy term for it. But this idea that part of where we've advanced to with regard to technology is the ability to either by duration or intensity or both, to put our bodies, to put our brains neurochemically in a state where what we can do now doesn't match the ordering of God's creation. Now, like we can see lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of videos, right, of lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of novel stimuli and different people, right? Like you could have one porn binge that gives you access to more novel sexual partners than like anybody that's ever lived, if you wanted to. Now, there's an intensity to that. And I think with this orgasmic model, that's what we see is this pursuit of the intensity of orgasm. That's dopamine. Chemists in the room, anybody? Love y'all. Right, pretty basic, kind of a throwaway neurotransmitter. We waste it all the time. Right? We waste it all the time because it's inexpensive to the body, right? Like it's just orienting us to like, is that thing going to be good or not? And if it is going to be good, like I better move toward it. So there's kind of two neural pathways, two highly dopaminergic neural pathways that I'll come back some point and give a brain lecture and bore you all to death. Right, but just know for orgasm, dopamine is not about the experience of pleasure. It's about anticipating goodness and moving us toward things that remind us of things that are good. Right, so there's kind of a motor coordination element to this and an anticipatory dimension to dopamine, right? But this idea of orgasm culturally is really about conquest, right? It's about maximizing pleasure, that pleasure becomes the paramount pursuit. Novelty is a fantastic way to produce dopamine. And there's redemptive sides to this too, right? Like when we travel and we're in new environments, naturally our brains produce more dopamine, right? Trying to orient us to, okay, like what in my environment is good and how do I move toward those things that are good? And that's really redemptive, like as we grow in age, right? Like there's a reason I want to start traveling with my wife because I'm not 25 anymore, right? And as my body changes, and as our sexual relationship has a different rhythm with kids, right? Like, guess what? Traveling becomes a great way to prime novelty to introduce a different intensity of connection. Doesn't mean you have like crazy sex on every trip when you're married, just FYI. Right? Like, it's just a way that in the rhythms of life, right, that we've been created with these cycles, even hormonally and in our neural functioning, neurotransmitters, right, that can operate congruently with God's design for the covenant of marriage. And it's a really beautiful thing. And in spite of the beauty, right, like we see a distortion. In spite of the goodness that's there, right, we have to navigate this cultural distortion, which says like novelty, meaning image after image after image, video after video after video, person after person after person is how I intensify the experience of orgasm. Right, experience, right, Don Juanism. Right? Like the more experience you have, you're the man. This would be the belt notch, right? Which I never understood. Like how many notches do you have in your belt? I don't know. One. Right? But experience, the idea of like having experience becomes a capital. Sexual experience becomes a form of capital in our world. And it's distorted. We have this really abbreviated sexual cycle. Right. Before I get there, though. Right. To recap this section, better sex means more intense orgasms. Right. And there's an allusion to this, right? Like this notion of the myth of orgasm, I think, really takes root here. And it's where a lot of sexologists and psychologists have really intruded on the hearts and minds of faithful Catholic folks, right? Because the recommendation is, right, having sexual trouble, like just go masturbate more and you'll leave her alone. Tell him to masturbate and he won't be bugging you for sex anymore. Just throw on some porn. And like these are actual recommendations that my colleagues give in the secular world. To which I ask, like, is that the best we can do? Right? Like, let's just try and add novel stimuli and increase the intensity of experience. Like, that's not working. It's not working. Right? But I wouldn't be surprised in a room this size if there's been folks who have gone to see a therapist and that's the best intervention that's been used. And we can do so much better than that. as a field. We're just really lazy because we default to, from love and responsibility, this myth of orgasm that gets perpetuated so regularly. So what does that look like? It looks like this, right? Like there's really not a whole lot of focus on being unaroused or even this experience of desire. It's kind of this constant state of looking for excitement, looking for intensity. Video games do this. Drug addiction does this. Right? High adrenaline, high stress jobs can do this. Like we just live in this state of constant excitability and looking for some type of stimulus, not even sexual, right? Like just, but our nervous systems literally get reprogrammed to be looking for that buzz of intensity. Right. And from there, you can move quickly into plateau and orgasm. Right? And then there's this crash, this kind of dopamine crash post-orgasmically. Right? But it's this crash that's being avoided, right? So it's not that there's avoidance in the same way biologically of disconnecting. It's that it's being replaced with things for a process called upregulation. Right? Could be I'm going to go back to the bar and find a different partner. Could be I'm going to go and use or drink or gamble or right, like take anything from our Western economies, right? Food, sex, drugs, work, gaming, gambling, right? There's a host of things that kind of help us mitigate the impact. And that's so much of the story that I want you to hear is that these distortions to God's design for sexuality are really about mitigating the consequences of the distortion. Right? Like I don't like the fact that this decision that I've made reveals my broken state, so I'm going to replace it with something so that I don't feel broken. And the resultant effect of that is a compounding of the brokenness that I'll talk about here in just a few minutes. All right, so here we intensify the BAM, but the POW, this post-orgasmic window, is still disengaged. It's not utilized, and therefore the fullness of God's design for sexuality is not experienced or inhabited for that individual. So this idea of hungry touch, right, like high dopaminergic touch. So in this process, right, like post-orgasmically, dopamine begins to fall. If it's not backfilled, right, and we'll talk about that here in a second, what does that mean? It means that other neurotransmitters and neuropeptides are intended to be produced if we persist in that space. But if we don't, there's this thing called a dopamine hangover that can last for about 7 to 14 days. We see colors less brightly. We are more lethargic. We're more fatigued. We're more irritable. Right? Marina Robinson talks about this in her book, Cupid's Poisoned Arrow. But there's a consequence. Like even when we try and mitigate the consequences, there can be a consequence. In this space, right, we'll put in the context of Christian marriage, the spouse begins to lose some luster, right? Like we're seeing through this kind of like gray lens. Right? And then we start interpreting things differently, like, well, she's getting really demanding or controlling. And we'll make these available to you if you want. I can send these out. And Father, can you post these on the Diocesan website? All right, so then there's this interpretation, right? Like, my body's doing this thing. It's impacting how I perceive relationship. Now I'm interpreting my bodily experience differently, right? It's not logical. Like, I'm going to go with how it feels. It doesn't matter if, like, I did this, right? Like, but it feels right for me to move away from her because she's being so ridiculous. Right? And then all of our emotional memories about that individual begin to get colored. She's always like this. Well, she would just leave me alone. Give me a break. Cut me some slack. This is crazy. I'm like, I don't care if you're newly dating or been married for 47 years, right? Like we can fall prey to this pattern. Right? And then our neurobiology kicks back on. Like you've been thinking and feeling a lot and you've been perceiving things from a sensory perspective. Like we better interpret this through the big guns, our amygdala, our fear center. Right? Like it's not good to be close to that person. They're a threat. We're going to have to feel all this stuff that we don't want to feel when we're close to that person, when we're reminded of that person. All right, and then our stress responses kick on, right? I mean, think about your worst relationship. I cannot believe you just asked that. I want you to think about your worst relationship you've ever been in or the worst time in your relationship. Right? Like at some point you went into fight, flight, or freeze. Like your sympathetic nervous system kicked on and you got stuck. trying to get away from someone, fighting them off, or like paralyzed. Right? And that's a pretty good indicator that there's this unhealthy cycle with how physical intimacy is being navigated. So what do? We find a way to self-soothe. Right? Like, let's go to unhealthy coping. Drinking, eating, drugs, vegging out on Netflix, gambling, gaming. Fortnite's amazing, by the way. If you're looking for an addiction, not quite as high quality. That's more like crack, like the good stuff. The pure stuff is like, I don't know. What games do you guys play on your phones? Clash of Clans, people? That's a pretty good one. What else do you play? Is he being serious? You don't have to call it out. Right, but think about it. Like, there's some games that like do an even better job because there's more immediacy of feedback. Like Fortnite, you got to play for a while to see if you win or lose. But like some of these games, you can go through 5 lives. Now I'm out of lives. What am I going to do? Am I going to spend the $1 because that stupid laughing clown is making fun of me? Or am I just going to like put my phone away and wait? Guilty. I see the guilt in your eyes. Like, we can all relate to this on some way, on some level. Right? But like, it's a manifestation, a reflection, right? Like, even on a video game level, like, we get drawn into self-soothing because the boss is being a jerk, right? But like, it can also intrude in this kind of hungry touch orgasmic cycle. And then, if that's not bad enough, like, we move into the space of objectification of our beloved, right? Like, they're being so ridiculous, but like, I want to have sex. So like, maybe if I just objectify them or use them as a means to an end. And there's not this completion of the sexual cycle, like, then we're back here. And then we're living into this space where there's this deterioration of relationship. And it operates on a sensory level, a cognitive level, a biological level, a will, level of the will. Like, I'm not using my will here very well. And there's this distortion. And to go to love and responsibility. I like this language. Shamelessness is a function of the interior of a person, and specifically of the will, which too easily accepts the sensual reaction and reduces another person because of the person's body and sex to the role of an object for enjoyment. Right? Like, even in our well-intended covenantal marriages within the realm of Christendom, right? Like, we can fall prey to this objectification of the other that uses them as a means to an end rather than this sacredness of otherness, right, as a person. Right? That language I would use in any association between a man and a woman, and in the sexual relationship itself, the object of an activity is, of course, always a person. And it is a person who becomes the proper source of various forms of pleasure or even delight. And I think this is a proclamation of God's design for our sexuality, right? Like, that the otherness of prostitution that certain politicians are trying to legalize and promise to legalize if they get elected, right? Like, there's an objectification in that we're wanting to normalize because of the contamination of our sexual imaginations, right? All the way to, if you watched what happened as my beloved Chiefs won the Super Bowl. No response. Tough crowd. You shouldn't joke when you're talking about heavy sex topics, Todd. True. Right? But if you watch the halftime show and all this conversation around the halftime show, right? Like, this clear objectification of female physiology, right? And the utilization of physical motions and physical acts and parts of the body to obtain power, to obtain influence. Right? Like, we shouldn't be surprised that Pornhub's searches for J-Lo and Shakira skyrocketed. Of course it would happen, right? Because like, that's what we do in a realm where we objectify others as a means to an end, right? Rather than orienting to them as a person. Again, this book is fascinating and fantastic, and these quotes are just mind-boggling. Naturally, then, to organize your actions with pleasure itself as the exclusive or primary aim is in contradiction with the proper structure of human action. 1960, right? Like, this peering into the future, this divine revelation, right? And these words perhaps ring truer now than ever before. And I love this, and kind of I've pulled some of these quotes because they're very congruent with my own kind of organic thinking about this presentation from years ago. A man and woman can become one flesh in the familiar words of the book of Genesis, with which the Creator defined the essence of marriage. And that oneness will not be a form of shamelessness, but only the full realization of the union of persons, which results from reciprocal conjugal love. Right? And that's, I think, the message that our world is needing, that there's this not just personhood, but that there's something specific and unique about conjugal love when we orient to it in its fullness and all the parts that can reveal something of this divine love that we're called to experience in relationship with our Lord. And that it's this full realization of the union of persons that somehow gives us access and insight into this reality, into this window of divine love. So let's take a look at more of a pair bonding perspective. Right? What happens when we orient this model, right, with pair bonding, this unitive dimension, as maybe the primary focal point? And when we have this as the primary focal point and order things properly and contain them all simultaneously, we begin to get a reflection of God's design. Right? When we talk about pair bonding, right, we really see that church teaching would state that our sexuality is to be shared. Right? Like this idea of reciprocity is so much of a part of love and responsibility as a text. Not only shared, but actually there's this idea of giving and receiving of ourselves that enhances the experience of pleasure, that transcends this orgasmic approach or fertilization-based approach that can't be experienced in the distortion, but can be realized in the fullness, in the wholeness. That connection is of utmost importance with the spouse. And in this way, we see this model operating in its fullness. So what is oxytocin? It's a hormone, it's a neuropeptide that drives things like the experience of love, or perception of love. It's produced when we cuddle, when we touch, when there's an experience of connection to one another socially, relationally, parents and children, right? Tickling, holding, caressing, breastfeeding, right? Like all these beautiful places of healthy relationship. And to include intimacy, right? Like social intimacy, intellectual intimacy, spiritual intimacy, and yes, even physical intimacy, sexual intimacy. We'll see oxytocin. Right? And it really builds on this idea of Christian anthropology that from the beginning, our Lord's declared that it's not good for man to be alone. It's not good for man to be alone, right? Like, and we can talk about the suitable helper in the context of marriage and the covenant of marriage, how important that is. Right, like, but it's both and. There's this reality of it's not good for us to be alone. We have social neurobiology. Like, and out of that, there's this more unique experience of relationship that we're called to be in the covenant of marriage. Right, and it's in this process of marriage that we build bonding contacts, these experiences that truly bind our hearts together, that attune our physiology in a way that looks different than every other type of relationship that might be seen or experienced. Great video to watch. It's a real short. You can find it on YouTube. It's called The Still Face Experiment by Ed Tronick, and it speaks to both the beauty of God's design for connection and then where this rupture happens, where the distortion is introduced in the human experience. And I think that's where we have to start paying attention to the distortions. It's the distortions don't start when our kids get iPhones or when they had unfiltered access to the internet. Right? Like the distortions more often than not, like sometimes those stories happen there. They begin there. Right? Like more often than not, our stories begin, the stories that I hear of folks who are struggling in these distorted models of sexuality start when there's this primary breakdown in the attachment relationship. Because we're not thinking about human sexuality as a holistic relational phenomenon, right? That even kids who are 2 years old can start having experiences of belovedness that are priming them to be healthy with their sexuality when they're later, being given language about their bodies that can prime them for healthy relational and sexual functioning later. And like, we don't want to tell our 2-year-olds what a penis is if they have one, or a vagina if they have one. Right? But it's a critical part of introducing ourselves as experts on the body so that they trust us and not Google. So that when they have questions, they reach to us and not the internet. Right? Like, I know it feels a bit scandalizing. Like, he said I should tell my 2-year-old the word penis. Right? Like, yes, you should if he has one. And if he doesn't, he's a she, and she needs to know what a vagina is. Right? And you can watch Jordan Peterson if you want a full breakdown on why that is. X's and Y's and genetics and all that good stuff. But yeah, we need to start doing that. We need to start thinking about the etiology of sexuality a bit earlier than like when their hormones are raging and they're prepubescent or pubescent. When we have this cycle operate in its fullness, it really starts from a place of contentment. It starts from a place of closeness and connection that naturally flows into desire, right? Like anticipating, right? Like, I think about you and desire the good for you, even when it's not a sexual good. Like, I just want you to have a good day. If we have sex tonight or not, like, that doesn't really matter. Like, I just hope that you're fine and safe on the road. And like, your boss isn't a jerk today. And like, this willing of the good in all parts of the experience that amplify this notion of desire, right? That then at certain times, right, like might cross the threshold into sexual excitability or sexual arousal, right? And like, not every time does sex even happen in this space, but it's navigated, it's co-navigated in healthy relationship. I told you I was going to talk about plateau for a little bit. I'll do that here. I've elongated the dynamic of plateau here, right? Because there's a lot of mythology around, and I think it gets back to individual pleasure, kind of this idea of like the egocentric utilitarianism of culture. Like, plateau is a space where our bodies just physiologically are preparing for orgasm, but it's continued stimulation and it's not doing a whole lot. But when I think about plateau and how plateau has really been misunderstood from a sexological perspective, when there's not a transcendent theological understanding of God's design for the human person, right? Like, it's an annoyance. Like, I keep doing this thing and nothing's happening. They're like, whoa, what happened? Right? But if we kind of reclaim this space and go, what if this plateau is a gift of timing and rhythm that's intended for us to communicate and pace and make sure that, in the words of Love and Responsibility, that there's a simultaneity around the climacteric. I love that word. Borrow from the text. Right? Like, that climax really is intended to be this psychological and spiritual and physical joining of experience that can be navigated, right? But like, we hear about the myth of the mutual orgasm, right? It permeated the sexual literature through the 1990s. Like, it's a myth, it can't happen. False, right? Like, it can't happen when we're so oriented to our own experience egocentrically, not because it can't physiologically. In fact, it's intended to. If we can slow down into a rhythm, if we can slow down into an understanding, a framework that prioritizes the mutuality of that. And what happens in that space? Well, there's this resolution experience. It's very different than avoidance. It's very different than, right, this crash experience. And there's a ton of oxytocin that's produced. And this experience of contentment becomes part of the rhythm of relationship that's activated by how we're navigating the sexual cycle. You'll notice that the POW is a lot bigger than the BAM in this appropriately ordered model of sexuality, which is on purpose, right? That the post-orgasmic window is of such critical importance here. You can call it sex flushing. There's a whole host of names that clinically and culturally we give to this space. But this post-orgasmic window is really unique in that it's one of very few times in our human experience that our sympathetic nervous system, our stress nervous system, bottoms out and doesn't operate the way it's supposed to. Why? Because something more important is happening. Think about that for a second. Like, your survival system shuts off for a second. That must be pretty important. Why? Because something more important is happening. That's the significance of this space of the post-orgasmic window. This 10 to 15 minutes where there's this flooding of oxytocin, right? This cuddle hormone, this bonding hormone, right? For guys, there's also vasopressin, which, right, is all about partner preference. Like we literally instinctively see our wives' faces faster and can pick them out in a crowd quicker because of the attunement that we experience. And now think about the significance of, like, even in our good, well-intended Christian marriages, and when we go through all of this, right, like, I just desire you and we're so content and so happy, but like then we don't allow this process of resolution to do what it's intended to do. Like we're missing out on the fullness of God's design, the goodness of God's design for how we're called to be one flesh. We're not talking about some biblical euphemism, right? Like they can't say sex in the Old Testament, so they say like, he knew her. They became one flesh. Like, no. Like we're literally talking about a type of bonding where our brains harmonize and coordinate and actually offset deficits for one another. Like it's incredible. But all too often, right? Like without understanding, without knowledge, because no one had a conversation like this ever in the church. Like in our good, well-intended Christian marriages, Catholic marriages, like we're not living into the fullness. We're living into the distortion, even accidentally, even unintentionally, because nobody had a conversation about how this might look, right? And what the function of this space really is. Walter Freeman, Norman Deutsch, one of my favorite authors, wrote a book, The Brain That Changed Itself. He quotes Walter Freeman, who says, it's afterplay, not foreplay, that counts in building trust. It's afterplay, not foreplay, that counts in building trust. Why? Because something significant is happening here. And I think in a culture that is struggling more with high divorce rates, struggling more with moving away from our families of origin to launch and take on new professional challenges, new careers, like we're less connected to ourselves. We're less connected to God, right? And out of that, it's really tough to lean in with intimacy. If there's brokenness in our story, if there's trauma that's unresolved, it's really tough to lean in and entrust ourselves completely to the other. Right? Like this space of afterplay, the pillow talk, the just laying and caressing and cuddling and holding, and not like getting up and whoosh. Like there's a sacredness to this space, and I don't use that word lightly. That really is about the fullness of God's design for our experiences. One of my favorite slides that I ever get to share. Right, like this is oxytocin. It's a 9 amino acid neuropeptide compared to dopamine. And I've got a simple question. It's really rhetorical. Like, which of these do you think is the fullness of God's design for our relationships? Right, this throwaway neurotransmitter that we waste on chocolate cake? Or this part of our human experience that shows up very exclusively in the context of bonding in critical relationships? Right? One day I'm going to get a Fulbright scholarship and I'm going to study milk-drunk babies. My, that took a left-handed turn quickly. Why, pray tell, Todd, are you going to study milk-drunk babies? Because I have this hypothesis that's really basic. That the place we see this intensity of entrusting ourselves from a reductionistic physiological level, like I want to go to my secular colleagues and say, I told you. Right? That milk-drunk babies and post-orgasmic adults, like there's a symmetry in their neurofunctioning. That's ultimately about our body's stress response turning off so that we can be experienced completely and totally and fully. Right? Because even our physiology proclaims the gospel if we'll just pay attention to it. But there's a fullness here that we need to pay attention to. I'll hustle so we can get to questions. We got started a few minutes late, so I apologize for running behind. I told you I was going to talk long. Father Sean already knew that. He was like, let's schedule him until 10. Right, that this oxytocin or oxytonergic cycle is really about selfless touch, right? Like not this egotistical, hungry, selfish touch, right? It's about selfless touch, right? Which really becomes, and touch is spiritual, touch is physical, touch is with the eyes, touch is with the hands, touch is with the tone of voice, that we touch way more than just tactilely. So this experience of touch and relationship is so powerful as far as how we connect and bond and trust. Right, and socially and spiritually, there's intimacy, and there's giving and receiving of comfort, acceptance, and protection. And when we feel safe, we deepen the experience of trust. Right, and when we trust, we bond. We quiet this alarm system of our brain. Right, this is good. This is safe. This is real. Right, then all of a sudden we share the load. It's not just us dealing with life stresses and traumas. We can do it together, conjointly. Right, when there's resolution, this sexual cycle, it produces more oxytocin and bonds us in a deeper way, which then perpetuates the experience of selfless touch. So I created this afternoon. It might not play, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. So this idea about feasting and fasting, what really shows up within the context of church teaching within Catholicism, the idea of periodic continence and the notion of sexual abundance, and kind of biblically this notion of feasting and fasting, right? That there are times when we celebrate and there's abundance and we enjoy, right? And there's times of fasting where we withhold intentionally. We sacrifice something intentionally. And I think that model becomes interesting for us to look at this notion of sexual abundance and periodic continence. Right, so the breakdown for me goes something like this. Right, like better connection means more oxytocin. That's just what it means. Eye-to-eye contact, gazing, hair stroking, hugging. Right, better connection means more oxytocin. More oxytocin means typically better orgasms, not more intense orgasms. I didn't say that. Like every qualitative study you can look at says people's experience, their endorsement of the quality of orgasm is higher when there's more oxytocin in their bloodstreams. Interesting. Right? That we're not created for necessarily the intensity of that. That the penultimate experience of orgasm actually happens in a state of calm and connectedness, not like high stimulation, high visual intensity. Right? It's the myth of orgasm from the text. Better sex leads to sexual abundance, right? Like when it's enjoyable and pleasurable and there's communication and being on the same page and resonance, right? And that sexual abundance leads to satiety. Like I feel full, like I'm fully connected, fully satisfied, right? And out of that place of satiety comes this experience of continence. I can move away. And obviously, like if we're talking about NFP here, like there's a natural order to creation in the rhythms that invite us to this model, by the way. It isn't like the Todd Bowman variation. Like you could put NFP up here and like charting and it would probably flow with this. You could make this model work pretty beautifully. Right? Why? Because we're orienting ourselves to God's design for something. In this instance, it's this notion of feasting and fasting that we see biblically. What if that applied in our sexual relationships in the context of marriage? That abundance and continence. It's not like continence, like I'm going to pick up my cross and suffer because it's not a green day. Right? Like, you could adopt that mentality, I guess, but like, I don't think that's what we're called to. Like, it means you haven't learned how to navigate the abundance side of the sexuality that we're called to share in the covenant of marriage. Right? And there's opportunity to lean into that and explore that differently. So that, like, continence becomes a natural resultant effect and not this like cross to be born. Right? And that in that place of continence, instead of begrudgedness in anticipation of the next green day, like all of a sudden there's emotional safety that's born. Because instead of orgasming about pleasure, it was about deepening connection. And then that safety births connection. And that connection births oxytocin. And then there's this rhythm. Right? That's not just like one revolution of the sexual cycle. It's this pattern of being in relationship in the context of marital love. Now I have to hurry because we have to have time for questions, and kids have bedtimes, and I could talk probably until 10 or later, but I won't. Right. We can make oxytocin all sorts of ways. This isn't just all right, I can already hear it now on the car ride home. Hey, babe, what do you say we go home and make some oxytocin? First of all, that line's not going to work. Why? Because I just showed all of your wives that there's other ways to make oxytocin. You're welcome, ladies. You're welcome. All right. Sweetie, that would be great. Let's make some oxytocin. How about you smile at me and look me in the eyes? That's not what I had in mind. Thanks, Todd. Right, lots of ways we naturally do this that I think resonate with church teaching, right? Like we see St. Paul talk about love and joy and peace and gentleness, self-control, right? Like it fits into how we navigate oxytocin and producing connection. All right, let's wrap up with this. The sexual urge is connected in a special way with the natural order of existence, i.e. the anthropological order that Father Sean started this series with, which is the divine order in as much as it is realized under the continuous influence of God the Creator. That's what we're made for, right? Like there's a sensibility and a resonance with God's design that shows up in the anthropological order that I think will shape how we understand sexuality here in just a second. In this sense, one person can give him or herself, can surrender entirely to another, whether to a human person or to God, and such a giving of the self creates a special form of love, which we define as betrothed love. I would posit to you that the fullness of God's design for human sexuality is when we navigate experiences of conjugal love in a way that holds these three in constant tension. That, as Father talked about the anthropological order, that in our sexual experience, we bring to bear in moments of sexual intimacy the totality of our story. Like, where are we from? What are our attachment experiences? Who did we bond to? What's our sexual story? Exposure to porn, sexual abuse, virginity, doesn't matter what it is, right? Like that we bring to that moment this idea of sonship or daughtership, that we're from someplace, and all of these attachment bonds, good, bad, or ugly, come with us into that space. Okay. There's also this being with, right? Like in addition, so we're this unitive dimension, this bonding dimension is present in that orgasmic moment. Right? Secondarily, there's this being with, right? Like that the orgasmic dynamic, if we recalibrate, it's not about intensity, but that it's a door opener to the neurochemical reality of this, so that this tension is orgasm matters, simultaneity of orgasm matters, so that we can both share in this moment where our bodies are attuning in a different way, while holding constant the reality of the being for, this experience of paternity that we're created for. That instead of the partiality, when we hold these together, it really is the anthropological order manifest in its fullness in a given moment. That simultaneously our story of being from and our story of being with and our story of being for is made manifest. Right? And in that we dispel the myth of orgasm. That's about egoism, that it's about pleasure, that's about intensity, that it's just about mechanically, like, let's doing this so we can have a baby. That the fullness of God's design for the human person, revealed in the anthropological order, is made very real in an incarnational way in that space. And in that way, it's different than any other experience we can possibly have. Right. A couple quotes and then we'll get to questions. Betrothed love comprises on one hand the gift of the person, and on the other hand, acceptance of that gift. Implicit in all this is the mystery of reciprocity. Acceptance must also be giving, and giving receiving. See, the fullness of self-giving love is evidenced foremost in this inherently relational nature of the Trinity. You see, in this way, the post-orgasmic window offers an incarnational window into God's design for the human person to receive the full measure of belovedness and to offer back that same measure of fullness in return. Which is an interesting place for us to get to, that there's something about navigating this experience of sexuality in a way that's ordered and congruent with God's design, that brings to bear the fullness of our experience as human persons and unifies us in a different way, that then points us to the reality of who God is. Right? That in the Trinity, there's this inherent being from and being with and being for. Right? That Father talked about. So to bring this, and I know it's been a lot, I told you we weren't going to be able to delve down into everything as deeply as we possibly could, but I want to end perhaps where we started this whole series, which is this quote from Joseph Ratzinger. You see, the real God is by his very nature entirely being for in God the Father, being from in his Son Jesus, and being with in the Holy Spirit. Man, for his part, is God's image precisely insofar as the from, with, and for constitute the fundamental anthropological pattern. Whenever we attempt to free ourselves from this pattern, we are not on our way to divinity, but to dehumanization, to the destruction of being itself through the destruction of truth. Y'all, if I could invite you to anything, it would be to continue wrestling with this idea of the fullness of God's design for human sexuality. It doesn't matter if you're single, doesn't matter if you're married, doesn't matter if you're engaged, doesn't matter if you're divorced. Right? Like that we're all invited to understand the beauty of God's design for our bodies and for our relationships. Right? And that together, we can, I'm sure there's questions that are awakened out of this that I probably didn't leave you guys time to ask. We'll get to them. But the invitation is for you to join with me and thinking Christianly and thinking here and now in a very Catholic way about the reality of these principles that have just been opened, right? I told you this isn't like a finality, a proclamation. It really is exploratory, right? This is the first time I have integrated love and responsibility and other works into this model. Like there's a lot of work for us to do. And I just invite you to collaborate with me in the reflection, in the conversing, in the ideating, and how can we continue to proclaim the reality of God's love into the world and have answers about the questions of human sexuality that are so pervasive in the world that we inhabit. And maybe, just maybe in that, the way in which we answer these questions about the reality of God's design for human sexuality could in and of themselves be a charismatic proclamation that God so loved the world. Thanks so much for listening. I know it's getting late. You might have a babysitter to relieve of responsibilities. I'm going to hang out for a while and just answer questions. So more than happy to take some questions for a while. And again, you're not going to hurt my feelings or offend me if you have something to get to or step out. So y'all that have to step out, thanks so much for being here and being with us. Safe travels on your way home. And those of y'all that are here with me for a little while longer, this is like overtime, extra time, bonus time. What questions about the content tonight, or just other questions pertaining to anything in the series, or tangentially anything about human sexuality that you always wanted to know but were too ashamed to ask? I made that way more dramatic than it needs to be. It can really be anything. Yep, great question. Yeah, great question. So the question was, if someone finds himself stuck in a pattern or has only experienced a pattern of distortion, how might they recalibrate and kind of switch tracks to get on a model of kind of the Oxytocin model? One of the primary things is that we do in at least the sex addiction recovery community is orgasmic fasting, like so 90-day period. And that might mean like have an accountability partner, might mean going to a group. Sometimes it's therapy. Everybody's story is a little bit different. What's in the soil is a question I always ask, because how one navigates that space of getting out of unhealthy cycles or living from distortion into healthy, it's really about like what else is going on that's driving that. What's the function of some of that? So, accountability, there's so many groups. Online resources can be helpful. Matt Fradd did one called Strive that could be helpful. It's like a 21-day detox process. Neurologically, it's going to take more than 21 days. It's going to take closer to 60 days to really change habit, change patterns of thinking, recalibrating neurobiologically. So like a 90-day non-orgasmic experience, and I do this with folks who are married too, right? Like, so it's, I don't know if you're married or single or engaged or what, but I think across the board, that's an important foundational level, is to kind of give our bodies a space to detox. Then talk about the toxic nature of dopamine, but dopamine really does ravage the sensitivity of our neurophysiology. So in a very real way, it's not just like I need to purify my mind for 90 days. Like, it really is on a neurological level, a recalibrating that needs to happen. 60 days is kind of the like agreed upon scientific definition for starting new habits or changing patterns of behavior. But I think 90 days allows one to not just modify the behavior, but then live into it and reinforce it for 30 days. But again, like, that looks different with regard to, sometimes if there's trauma, if there's anxiety related stuff, if there's neglect stuff, if there's family of origin stuff, like, everybody's soil looks a bit different. So kind of customizing what that might look like, what you need to accomplish that 90 days might look different from person to person to person. I think spiritual disciplines obviously need to be a part of that. As far as, again, not just I'm going to stop doing this thing, but like, how do I begin to replace the functionality of that? Right? Like, if the function of the distortion was like, it helps me get to sleep or helps me calm down before I take a test. There's a great Scrubs episode, terrible show. Do not go watch that show. Right? Like, where Dr. Cox turns to Turk and says, "Physician, heal thyself," and like tells him to go by himself into the sex closet to masturbate so that he can perform the surgery that he's about to do adequately. Right? Like, yikes. Like, if that's the function of our distortion, is to calm us down so we can accomplish things professionally, right? Like, we're going to have to find something different to replace the functionality of that behavior, or it's just going to intensify over time. And then eventually, like, he's going to fail out of med school or be a terrible surgeon, like, because he's, right, like, ravaging his brain with dopamine. So spiritual practices become a fantastic way to replace the functionality of, like, calming through prayer. Spiritual journaling, spiritual writing is huge. Spiritual direction, I think connection, like any place you can activate connection, is a huge way to replace the functionality of the distortion. So it's a great question. As you can see, like, it's a really big question because there's lots of facets to it, and like, everybody's story is going to be a little bit different. So there's some generalities that are going to have to be fleshed out in the context of therapy, spiritual direction, friends, family members, trusted confidants that can help you navigate that. But it's a good question. It's a big question. Yeah. So, yeah, broad question. But if someone came and asked me what's the most important thing to do in teaching your kids about sexuality, what is it? That's a big question. I mean, language is such a huge part. So I'm going to answer it this way. We live in a time when, sorry for those of you that don't have kids yet, I'm going to like totally terrify you out of having kids. That's not the function of my response. We live in a time when peer-on-peer sexual abuse is at an all-time high, and there's no indicators that trend is going to stop. So what I see as I consult with my peers around the country on really hard cases involving peer-on-peer sexual abuse, or even like adult to child perpetrations, it's certain states, it's really hard for prosecutors to prosecute if a child doesn't have biologically appropriate language. So beyond just the, like, I'm establishing myself as the authority on things pertaining to sexuality for a 2-year-old, like my child, like you're in the bathtub. Hey, like, this is a real convenient time. Like, you need to wash your penis. All right. Like, it's not my penis, daddy. It's my peppy. Like, I don't care what you call it. Like, it's your penis. Right. Cause like, I don't want the prosecutor to be like, what's a peppy? Right. Like, so I think just there's multiple dimensions to why I say that's of critical importance. Like, one is the ordering of the family structure so that like kids know that I'm authority about important things. Cause at some point it's not going to be just like, is this a penis or not a penis? It's going to be like, what do I do with this? Is God really real? Right. Like, so from an early age, we can be establishing ourselves in significant ways as an accurate and authoritative place of good information, trustworthy information. It opens channels of communication in the event that something might happen. And then it subsequently like gives them the language that they would need to communicate about exactly what happened if something bad did happen in their experience. So I think that idea of starting early with languaging body parts, right? There's some great books that, Father, I know you've worked hard to get in the schools here locally, and right, they're read-alongs, but it's not a one-time deal. I think that's kind of the mythology of parenting is, so I wrote this book called Angry Birds and Killer Bees, talking to your kids about sex a few years ago. And of course, like you write a book like that, your mom's going to call. I'm so proud of you. Thanks, Mom. Like, I remember our sex talk. That's funny, Mom. I don't. Actually, that's why I wrote the book, because we didn't have a sex talk. Oh, but we did. That one time I was standing in my bathroom and you were sitting on the waterbed and like I just told you. And I was like, it didn't stick if you did. Right? In fact, I wrote this book because lots of us my age like didn't get a good talk. So like now we have to know how to talk to our kids. All right, it's this fascinating idea where in my mom's mind, like one conversation was sufficient. Right? And I think sometimes there's this awkwardness and we want to like not have to do it often. So like we just have it one time and call it good. But like if we can language for our kids the body parts, and as they age, persist with them in that conversation, it does something really important. It takes us back into our own story. And what I hear most frequently from people is the reason they won't engage this ongoing conversation with their kids about their bodies and sexuality is because their own unresolved experiences of trauma or victimization or brokenness. Right? So like the gift we give our kids is not just this opportunity to be safe if something bad happens because they know what to call it and will talk with us because we establish ourselves as the experts. Like us stepping into that space with our kids takes us back in our own stories and invites us to resolve any of the wounds or hurts or betrayals that we experienced. Because the stats don't lie. Right? Like 1 in 3 women, 1 in 5 men will be sexually assaulted by the time they're 18. Right? And if we've not tended that space and found healing for that, like having kids will awaken that. Right? One of my clients is a Catholic OBGYN, and we talk all the time about how did your deliveries go this week? Like, well, I could tell which of my 2 patients had been sexually abused because the delivery was different. Our own stories, right? Like, and my guess is in our time together tonight, your own story's been awakened in some way. Right? But all the more so when talking to our kids about a really delicate topic where we don't know, like, what are our friends going to think? Right? Like, my friends think I'm crazy. Right? But they also were their friends that were like, hey, you wrote that book. Would you come talk to our kids? I was like, no, read it and talk to your kids. Right? Because we have to go back and address our own unresolved wounds in the context of helping steward and shepherd our kids' sexuality as they grow in age. So it's not a one-time deal. The whole notion of giving them language is as much about equipping them to be safe and communicate with us if something does happen as it is about us having to go back and till the soil of our own heart and resolve our pains and wounds and traumas from the past so that we don't pass them on to our kids. So that we don't pass them on to our kids. It's a big question. It's a great question, though. Yeah, a lot of it has to do with dissociation. So there's some active dissociation that shows up when a mother in labor has a history of sexual trauma that hasn't been resolved. So a lot of it is unresolved trauma that shows up. Oh yeah, there's a lot of belligerence that can show up. There's a lot of medical noncompliance that can show up. So there's a lot of restraining, right? Like, so if you think about like the sympathetic nervous system, like fighting, flighting, or fleeing. Freezing, right? Like there's some freezing and clenching. And like if you're trying to push, but like you're restraining and like withholding, like your body's trying to do one thing and your will is trying to protect you from something that happened a long time ago. But that dissociative state is really disconnective and makes the birthing process a lot harder. Yeah, no, it's great. Congratulations. That's incredibly exciting. And irrespective of trauma history, right? Like I think obviously, like doing the things that we know are important with a doula, with a midwife, with an OBG, whatever, OBGYN, like doing I think prayer is an important part of that. Like, I think we really underestimate the physiological impact of prayer and how it activates our parasympathetic nervous system. And like, obviously you're going to be in pain because like the physics of delivering a baby are the physics of delivering a baby. And like when you're relaxed, your body can, in spite of the pain, like your body will do what it's intended to do. Right. And like, and there's a whole tangent I'm not going to go on right now about like the difference between anal muscle tissue and vaginal muscle tissue, because I think that also speaks to God's design for sexuality. That might be important to have in your back pocket in a place like Lincoln, because I'm sure that's a prominent conversation here. I'm just guessing. But the idea of like allowing prayer to do in our parasympathetic nervous system what it's intended to do, this calming, connective experience, I think is a critical part of that. I think so. Things like Lamaze become kind of supplemental dimensions of like, how do I breathe in a way to get my body relaxed? But like on the front end, right, like de-stressing life by way of intentionality of prayer, could be journaling. Exercise is a big one, like sustaining an exercise regimen just so that your body is physically fit. So I think spiritually, physically, and I'd even say emotionally, like having the people in the room that you want in the room that can speak to you, that can ground you, that can call you. Like if you go into a place of intensified pain or trauma dissociation, can ground you and call you out of that is really important as well. So physically, spiritually, and emotionally kind of prepping that space and planning that space. Right? Like, because every mother has had that. Like, you've got this talk from someone, right, before you had a baby. Probably not, right? You wish you had. So I think being intentional in those things is really important. And if there is any type of trauma, I think having the opportunity to do some specific preparation for that, either with a counselor or psychologist, someone that can kind of help you walk through understanding your body's carried symptoms and experiences. So somatic experiencing is a trauma intervention that really helps us reintegrate and make sure we're not going into dissociation when there's a vaginal delivery or intercourse or whatever the experience might be. So, yeah. But again, congrats on the baby. Yeah, a great book to pick up to help you kind of evaluate that, maybe. So the question was about like, how might symptoms in my body be reflections of something from the past, and how would I know? For those of you listening online, if you're still there. I teach online, so it's always a fascinating, like, are my students still really there, or are they not? The Body Keeps the Score is a book by Bessel van der Kolk. Right, so the title is The Body Keeps the Score. And I think it will be helpful as far as leaning into just making sense of how our bodies carry symptoms that our minds can't process because they're either too intense or too intrusive. So even doing some reading to help prime me, like, okay, what is my experience? How does the content of this book maybe resonate? And I think for anybody that's dealing with kind of post-traumatic stuff, not even just sexually, emotionally, relationally, The Body Keeps the Score is just a must read. And if you're not in therapy, like, read that book, and you probably will be, because it is a catalyst for moving us toward healing. It really is. Like, when you can start understanding how our bodies are trying to resolve our traumatic experiences, but how you need a space to integrate those, either like integrating your memories with the present tense and your logic, literal, linguistic, linear thinking brain, or reconnecting like your mind to your body, like there's EMDR or there's somatic experiencing. It will help convince you to do the work that you've been putting off. And like finding, and thankfully you've got a great resource with Father Sean, who's pretty attuned to the therapeutic community here and the surrounding areas. Someone that can help you find a good trauma therapist, because it doesn't have to be that way. Like your story, you don't have to stay stuck re-experiencing all these intrusive parts of a story that was never intended to be. Like, there's healing and the fullness of healing that you can find and experience. So The Body Keeps the Score. Great book. Bessel van der Kolk. Y'all, it's truly been a pleasure to be with you. Again, I could talk forever, which you're like, okay, I've got to go study, like, get out of here. Thanks for being a captive audience and a gracious audience, and for just great questions, great dialogue. And available to you. Again, we're together a lot and we're good buddies. And if there's something that comes up that Father Sean can help you with that needs a clinical perspective, like, I avail myself to you by way of him, because we talk a lot, and I'm happy to help, right? Like, that's really what I'm here on the earth for, is to help. So I live in Kansas City. Yep. So go Chiefs. So thanks, y'all.